Throughout history, empires have built their glory not just on conquest and gold, but on bodies, especially the young, male bodies stolen, trained, and reshaped for pleasure, politics, or power. These were the forgotten prisoners of royal courts, boys taken from their families, stripped of identity, and remade into objects of desire or pawns in elite games. From the Ottoman harems to the grand palaces of China, from the cruel castration chambers of Europe to the royal compounds of African kingdoms, male sex slaves were hidden in plain sight, seen by kings and queens but erased from the stories we tell. This is not just a tale of suffering, but of survival. Some of these boys endured unspeakable brutality. Others rose through the ranks and rewrote their fate. But all of them lived in a world that treated their bodies as tools of empire. Here are their stories. Number 7. The Ottoman Boy Slaves. Behind the marble halls and gold-plated doors of a Topkapi palace, a shadowed world thrived, one where beauty meant captivity and silence was a survival skill. The Ottoman Empire, famed for its military might and architectural wonders, also perfected a system of acquiring young boys to serve both in statecraft and in far darker roles. Through the devshirme system, Christian boys from the Balkans were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and raised within the empire's rigid hierarchy. While many were groomed to become elite soldiers or bureaucrats, a select few, especially those of striking beauty, were funneled into more secretive roles within the imperial court. Some became Cossacks, boys trained as dancers who wore feminine clothing, makeup, and jewelry, entertaining high-ranking men at lavish feasts. Their dances were sensual, their presence desired. But beyond performance, many of these boys were also subjected to sexual exploitation. Others were brought into the harem, a place widely misunderstood as the exclusive domain of female concubines. In truth, the harem housed a small, secret population of enslaved boys, eunuchs and non-eunuchs alike, kept for the pleasure of powerful men. These boys were stripped of their past, castrated in horrifyingly brutal procedures that only a few survived, and then trained to serve with grace and submission. Their lives were completely controlled. They could not form bonds, voice resistance, or ever leave the walls that confined them. For the most favored among them, there was a possibility of rising through the ranks, even wielding influence from within the palace. But most remained nameless, their suffering hidden behind the grandeur of Ottoman opulence. European visitors occasionally recorded scandalous whispers of this hidden world, but official Ottoman histories rarely mentioned these boys, choosing silence over shame. Today, their stories remain buried under centuries of denial, yet their presence shaped courtly life, politics, and the very culture of the empire. The legacy of the Ottoman boy slaves is not just one of exploitation, it's a haunting testament to how empires twist youth and beauty into tools of domination. Number 6. Ancient Rome. In the marble villas and torchlit chambers of ancient Rome, male slaves were not just laborers or gladiators, they were often intimate property, used for pleasure by citizens of every rank. Roman society was built on a strict hierarchy, and at the very bottom stood enslaved boys, many taken from conquered lands like Gaul, Greece, or North Africa. These boys, often chosen for their youth and appearance, were assigned to serve elite households, not as sons or students, but as sex objects. Wealthy Romans kept pueri delicati, literally delicate boys, whose sole role was to entertain their masters both socially and sexually. These boys were dressed in fine silks, perfumed, and sometimes even adorned with jewelry, their bodies groomed to appear eternally youthful. Castration was not uncommon, especially for those intended to remain sexually desirable without growing into manhood. Roman law did not recognize these acts as crimes. In fact, it allowed a citizen full control over his slaves' bodies, regardless of age. Even prominent philosophers like Seneca or Cicero wrote disapprovingly of such indulgences, but the practice remained widespread, especially among the aristocracy. In the bathhouses and feasting halls of Rome, these boys were present but voiceless, expected to amuse, arouse, and never resist. Some, like the infamous Sporus, a young boy whom Emperor Nero reportedly castrated and married, rose to dark notoriety. Sporus was paraded in imperial attire, made to act as Nero's empress, and subjected to a life of public humiliation masked as privilege. His story is one of the few that survives, a chilling example of how sexual exploitation in Rome was cloaked in ceremony. While Roman poets and historians occasionally hinted at the emotional bonds between masters and their male slaves, these relationships were rooted in absolute power, not love. The empire's grandeur was mirrored by cruelty, and for countless boys trapped in its system, pleasure was never their own. Ancient Rome celebrated beauty and dominance, but for its male sex slaves, those ideals became a gilded prison with no escape. Number 5. The Boys of the Forbidden City. Deep within the towering red walls of Beijing's Forbidden City, where emperors were considered sons of heaven, another kind of boy existed, far from divine, yet crucial to the empire's most intimate functions. These were the court eunuchs, many of whom entered imperial service as boys, often sold by desperate families or seized from conquered regions. Though their official role was to serve the emperor and his household, their castration marked them for a far more complex and often exploitative existence. While the public believed these eunuchs to be neutral, sexless beings guarding the purity of the imperial harem, reality told a different story. Some boys, especially those who had not undergone complete castration or were allowed to keep part of their anatomy, were groomed for the emperor's or prince's personal desires. Cloaked in fine silk but stripped of autonomy, these boys were used as instruments of both control and pleasure. The inner court was a world of ritual, but it was also a theater of unspoken vices. Young eunuchs, prized for their loyalty and helplessness, became confidants, companions, and sometimes unwilling lovers to the most powerful men in China. As they aged, a rare few could climb the ranks, manipulating palace politics and gaining enormous influence. Figures like Wei Zhongxian and Li Lianing proved that eunuchs could outmaneuver even ministers. But their rise came at the cost of youth, identity, and often, their bodies. For the majority, life was defined by isolation and silent suffering. Forbidden to marry, father children, or leave the palace, these boys became living tools of empire, their existence sanitized in official records but whispered about in court gossip. Visitors from the West wrote of the eerie beauty and obedience of the young eunuchs, but rarely understood the trauma beneath their composed faces. In the grandeur of the Forbidden City, male beauty was both revered and violated. These boys, trapped in the empire's inner sanctum, served not just emperors, but a cruel system that demanded everything and gave almost nothing in return. Number 4. Male concubines of African kingdoms. Across the rich and diverse empires of pre-colonial Africa, royal courts were not only centers of political power but also places where human bodies, both male and female, became instruments of royal desire. In kingdoms like Dahomey, Mali, and among certain house estates, male concubinage existed in complex, often hidden forms. While female concubines were openly acknowledged and sometimes celebrated, their male counterparts lived in the shadows, their roles shrouded by oral tradition, secrecy, and the politics of gender. In some royal households, young boys were selected for their beauty and obedience, and brought into the palace compound to serve kings or elite nobles in intimate roles. These boys were often slaves acquired through warfare or tribute, stripped of family ties, and inserted into a strict hierarchy where their bodies were both currency and offering. Some were castrated to ensure loyalty and eliminate threat. Others were given titles and fine garments, dressed in gender-blurring robes and made to serve in the king's inner chambers. In several regions, spiritual beliefs framed the king as semi-divine, beyond the rules of ordinary morality. This allowed royal men to engage in same-sex relationships under the guise of ritual or divine right, especially when fertility rites or power symbols were involved. The male concubines were rarely allowed to leave the palace, never permitted to marry, and often erased from historical memory once their usefulness faded. However, in some cases, these boys wielded soft power, serving as close confidants or gatekeepers to the king. Oral histories from places like Buganda and modern-day Uganda recall Kabaka kings who kept male pages or lovers, stories once suppressed during colonial rule but now resurfacing through local scholarship. European colonizers, upon encountering these practices, reacted with horror and imposed Victorian morals that further silenced the existence of male concubinage in African courts. Yet the traditions endured, hidden beneath layers of shame and denial. Today, the stories of these boys remain fragmented, buried under centuries of cultural taboo and colonial erasure. But they were there, in the palaces, behind the thrones, their lives shaped by the desire and domination of kings who saw them not as sons or citizens, but as instruments of royal indulgence. Number 3. The Eunuchs of Imperial China. In Imperial China, eunuchs were far more than silent servants. They were the unseen machinery of dynastic power, and many began their path in boyhood, under the knife. From the Han to the Ming and Qin dynasties, thousands of boys were castrated and sent to serve in the Forbidden City, their manhood sacrificed for access to the empire's inner sanctum. Some were poor children sold by desperate parents, others were prisoners of war or kidnapped and trafficked into the imperial system. The process of castration was brutal and often deadly, involving the removal of both penis and testicles, with no guarantee of survival. Those who lived entered a world of rigid discipline, strange privilege, and constant danger. Officially, eunuchs were employed to guard the women of the palace and manage domestic affairs. But many were used in far more intimate capacities, particularly the young ones. Emperors and high-ranking officials sometimes chose beautiful boy eunuchs to act as personal attendants, pleasure companions, or even symbolic lovers, masked behind titles like imperial favorites or trusted pages. These boys, groomed to serve with absolute obedience, were expected to anticipate desires, flatter egos, and fulfill roles that went far beyond servitude. They were dressed in embroidered robes, taught to move with grace, and forbidden to show personal will. Though court records often avoided the explicit truth, historical gossip, private letters, and foreign envoys reports hinted at the sexual exploitation of boy eunuchs, especially by emperors known for indulgence. The psychological toll was immense. Stripped of gender identity, family connection, and bodily autonomy, they existed in a twilight state of power and pain. Yet ironically, some rose to immense influence. Figures like Cheng He, the famed admiral, or Li Lianying, the feared advisor of Empress Dowager Cixi, began as boy eunuchs and became kingmakers. Their ascent was rare but revealing. In a system built on erasure, the most invisible could sometimes become indispensable. Still, for the vast majority, life ended in obscurity, buried not just in unmarked graves, but in a silence enforced by imperial shame. The eunuchs of China were not merely bureaucrats. Many were boys forced into unnatural roles, reshaped to serve a dynasty that claimed heaven's mandate, while denying them even the right to be human. Number 2. The Castrati of Europe. In the candlelit chapels and glittering opera houses of 17th and 18th century Europe, an angelic voice could lift hearts to heaven, but behind that divine sound was a horrific price. The castrati were boys who had been castrated before puberty to preserve their high-pitched vocal range, their bodies and lives forever altered to satisfy the musical and aesthetic demands of European elites. While these boys were officially trained for sacred music and stage performance, their physical uniqueness and otherworldly voices also placed them at the center of a dark, erotic fascination that blurred art, power, and sexual exploitation. Castration was illegal in many parts of Europe, but it was tolerated, especially in Italy, when done under the guise of preserving musical talent. Poor families, lured by the dream of fame and wealth, sold their sons to conservatories, where they were cut and trained. The lucky few became stars, like Farinelli or Senesino, adored across Europe. Their voices were praised as miracles, and their bodies became spectacles, tall, with swollen ribs, pale skin, and a strange androgyny that enthralled both men and women. Castrati were not just performers, they were courted by aristocrats, housed by monarchs, and whispered about in the salons of Paris, Rome, and Vienna. Behind the scenes, many were treated as erotic novelties. Their supposed sexual safety made them favored attendants to noblewomen, while their ambiguous gender sparked fascination in libertines and clergy alike. Some lived in luxury, others, less successful, ended up in poverty, ridiculed and discarded. The Church, which employed hundreds of castrati in choirs like the Sistine Chapel, condemned sodomy but turned a blind eye to the mutilation of boys in God's name. Letters and memoirs hint at abuse, loneliness, and lifelong suffering, masked by applause. These boys, many under 10 when castrated, never consented to their fate. They were shaped, physically and emotionally, by a system that prized beauty and sound above humanity. While the world remembers their music, it forgets their pain. The Castrati of Europe were not simply singers. They were crafted objects, made to entertain, to awe, and too often, to serve darker pleasures behind the velvet curtains of power. Number 1. When they rebelled, from slave to power. Not all male sex slaves remain silent victims. A rare few, through cunning, beauty, or sheer endurance, rose from bondage to power, transforming the very systems that once consumed them. Their stories are scarce, often rewritten or suppressed, but they remind us that even in the darkest corners of imperial cruelty, rebellion flickered. One of the most haunting examples is Malakamba, born in Ethiopia and sold into slavery as a child. He was taken to India, castrated, and trained for palace service, but he defied every expectation. Using his intellect and strategic mind, he eventually became a powerful military leader and kingmaker in the Deccan sultanates, outmaneuvering both local rivals and European colonizers. Though his early life remains shadowy, his rise is a testament to resistance within the belly of empire. In China, certain eunuchs who had begun their palace life as sexual servants later wielded terrifying influence. Wei Zhongshan, once an obscure eunuch, became the de facto ruler during the late Ming dynasty, controlling court appointments, punishing rivals, and rewriting history in his own name. He had begun as a boy robbed of manhood but ended as the most feared man in the empire. In the Ottoman Empire, some boys brought into harems or trained as entertainers managed to manipulate their favor into political survival. They learned the secrets of the court, brokered alliances, and even outlived the sultans they once served. Their power, though rooted in submission, eventually became weaponized. Even in Rome, slaves who had once been sexually exploited could rise if their master freed them, becoming influential freedmen who shaped imperial policy from the shadows. These rare cases didn't undo the horrors they endured, but they cracked the illusion of total power. They proved that agency, though crushed, could resurface in astonishing ways. These boys-turned-power brokers walked a tightrope between humiliation and control. They learned to flatter, manipulate, and survive inside systems designed to erase them. Their rebellion wasn't always dramatic. It was quiet, strategic, and often cloaked in obedience. But it was rebellion all the same. In a world where their bodies were claimed by empires, these few dared to reclaim their futures. They remind us that even within chains, some found ways to forge a sword. The empires of the past did not only conquer lands, they conquered bodies. And among the most silenced were the boys taken, broken, and reshaped into tools of pleasure and control. From the cold marble of Rome to the silken corridors of the Forbidden City, these male sex slaves existed in the margins, groomed for obedience, stripped of choice, and hidden behind gold and ceremony. Their stories were rarely written, their names erased, their suffering cloaked in grandeur. Yet history whispers their presence, in the footsteps behind emperors, in the songs of the castrati, in the silent glances exchanged behind palace doors. Some found power. Most did not. But all lived under systems that denied their humanity. By remembering them, we don't just honor the victims, we confront the darkest desires of empire. These boys were not lovers, not servants, not ornaments. They were captives. And it's time we told their stories not as curiosities of the past, but as a brutal reflection of what power does when left unchecked. The glory of empire often came at the cost of human lives. These were some of them.